Hello. This is Physics 105, if you're in the wrong room. There's next down the street. I'm Richard Goldberg. This is Rules of Engagement, Mitigating Security Risk and Information Security Work, excuse me. And this is meant to be an overview of some of the problems you may face that you may not have thought of. If you've seen some of my other talks, you'll have seen some of these before. This is a continuation of that. How not to get pwned by your clients, part 2. First, a bit of a disclaimer. I am a lawyer. That's not the disclaimer. Although I noticed I'm the second lawyer to talk today, which usually, if you talk to 2 lawyers in one day, usually you've done something very wrong, or you're getting divorced. But I'm a lawyer. I am not your lawyer. This is not legal advice. Well, except some of you. I actually am some of your lawyers. But unless you already know that, I'm not your lawyer. One more thing. I mean for this to be a conversation. If you have something to say, you have a question in the middle, just shoot it out here. Although I'm reminded there's a play I saw called Art. And it's about 3 guys, one guy buys a piece of art, and they talk about it for an hour and a half. And these 3 guys, one guy will talk, 2 guys will talk, there'll be 3 people talking. And one of the actors was interviewed and said, I was having trouble with some of the script. And so I asked the playwright, I said, I'm having trouble with this monologue. And the playwright said, it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. The other 2 just don't happen to interrupt you. Take from that what you will, but if you want to scream out, go for it. So there are 4 things I'm covering. As I said, it's an overview, and so I'm going to group them together. But it's this kind of work: pen tests and audits together, and incident response and forensics together. And it's the similarities that I want to talk about. So you do that kind of work, what's the worst that can happen? Besides not getting paid. So imagine you do a pen test or audit, and you think, well, why don't I send them a little email and see who responds and what happens? But you think the Nigerian scam is sort of a little, it's an obvious scam. A little too obvious. So you think, well, I don't want to name any names, but I'm Bo McBay, and I want to do a test on a bank. And so, you wonder what, like we all get the bank spam, right? Where you try to, what do the banks get? So, you think, I know, I'll send them a little phishing email. And you find an unsuspecting employee who's just trying to do her job at the bank, and you send her this email. And she reads it, and it looks like this. I don't know if you know this guy, his business partner's in the room. I'll just go through it. This is a service message. It's got to sound very serious so that somebody wants to click on it. And this is very sensitive data, and you spend a lot of time working this out, right? Contact our help desk immediately, and you try to make it sound very professional. There's a verification process, make sure it remains secure. You put the little logo of this company that's not involved, right? Joe does not work for them, or Bo, excuse me, does not work for them. But you put, you want to make it, Plur is a well-known company. You think people will believe it. Now, you put all this work into it, except that, she thinks, oh, Plur, that's really well-known. All she sees is this, a link. And so, of course, she clicks it. And then she calls her boss. And he says, what's up? She says, well, I just got this email from a Plur. It looks very serious. He says, oh, we better investigate that. Call the CEO and call IT and make sure they investigate this and have this thing done in a week. And so they do the investigation, of course, and she thinks, oh, did I do a good job? I clicked on the link and I told my boss. A few days go by, IT gets involved. They investigate. They put 3 people on it and hundreds of man hours just working around the clock trying to figure out what this is. And then they figure out that it's not real. And so the CEO reads the report and he calls Plur. He says, what are you doing? Why are you sending this unsolicited mail trying to get us to give you business? And so they contact Sean from Plura, You know, it looks like, you can tell it's him because that's his mustache. You watching, John? And he says, I didn't do that. Somebody's using my name, my good name, and making me look bad. And you know, the CEO's gonna tell his CEO buddies. And so they call their lawyer. Who sues you? So let's avoid this. That's the idea behind what we're gonna talk about today. So when I talk about the future of security, I mean sort of in a corporate sense, who's getting hired and what's happening. And just as a small overview, there's a PwC study that says companies are planning to increase overall security spending by 52% this year, which is a 5-year high. Thing is, they're planning to reduce the number of full-time security professionals. 43% say that, which means what we're really talking about is a lot of outsourcing of the kind that Bo McVeigh does or that Plur does. So let's look at pen tests and audits together. They have some things that are very similar, even though, you know, they don't always do the same thing. So imagine you start a test. And you go out investigating, start checking out the boxes and see what's happening, and then all of a sudden, something falls over. Okay, you've set up this contract with this company to do the work, and you said, oh, here's what we're gonna do. You told them how much it cost, and you told them basically what you'll be doing. But you haven't figured out who to call if something goes wrong. Or, if there's a breach soon afterward, imagine you do an audit, and everything looks fine. But between the time you do the audit and you know, maybe a week later, something happens. Or, like we just heard, you tell them all the problems, and they say, oh yeah, we'll fix them, and then they don't, but they say they did. The question becomes, did you do a negligent audit? You know, did you certify them in some way that you shouldn't have? Or did you do a perfectly good job, and there's nothing wrong with it? And someone's just gonna blame you. So there was an article in Wired a year ago about something that happened a few years ago. It was a first, a data breach suit against an auditor. And here's what happened. There's a company called Card Systems. Card Systems repair credit card transactions. And the suit was against a company called Savvis, which was the auditor. Savvis had gone in and done an audit and said everything's great. The thing is that Card Systems didn't get sued. The auditor did. You might think, well, why wouldn't you sue the company that let all the data out, right? It was their damn fault. Well, the problem was that they went into bankruptcy. So you couldn't sue them. And there was another company, a bank, right? Because Card Systems worked with a bunch of different member banks, and they claimed that Savvis had done a negligent test that should never have certified them. So was it negligent? Well, I'm reminded there was a contracting security company for physical security in Iraq, worked with the Iraqi Provisional Authority. And they were hired to, among other things, provide bomb-sniffing dogs. Now, the company was called Custer Battles, which is not what it sounds like. It was two people, one named Custer and one named Battles. One was a military officer, and the other one was, I think, a Secret Service agent. And they got together, had essentially no experience doing this, and put this company together to do security for the Iraqi Provisional Authority, Coalition Provisional Authority, which of course is not the Iraqi government and isn't the US government either, right? It's just this sort of amorphous thing. So one of the things they had to do was provide bomb-sniffing dogs. And there's a certification process for that, right? And you show up with your bomb-sniffing dog and you're certified and the pooch is certified to sniff for bombs. The problem was that they just sent regular dogs. And they did an investigation, and one of the people on the ground said that the dog would just lie down and refuse to sniff the vehicles. He'd just take a nap. That's a negligent test. So, Savvis is sued. And in the complaint, it says that at the time that they issued the certification, this was the precursor to the modern, it was called, I think, CSP or CIS, but it was modern PCI, or the precursor to PCI. Card Systems had been improperly and continually storing unencrypted cardholder data. exactly what they weren't supposed to do. Now, Merrick Bank, which is the one that sued, it's Merrick Bank v. Savis, was a third party. And you might think, if I do a test and I issue some sort of report and I do it to say this company called this credit company, and then one of their clients has a problem because something happens afterwards. It's not my problem, right? So why did Merrick sue Savis? Well, because the other company didn't have any money. And when a company declares bankruptcy, you still need to sue somebody. Another kind of suit is called a shareholder derivative suit. And the idea is that even if the company you work with doesn't sue you because you're close with them or they understand what happened or they don't believe that you're in the wrong, the shareholders can sue on behalf of the company. In fact, it's designed so that shareholders can sue when the company will not. And this is sort of a similar problem. If they lose money, they may come after you. A third risk is a subpoena. Now, I know that you've heard of subpoenas on television, and I'm sure that you have a perfectly accurate view of what a subpoena is from watching television. But just in case you don't, I'll give you...
I read the internet.
I learned it on the Google too, so let me just explain what it is. When one company sues another company, there's a complaint and an answer, right? And it's called the motions practice, the beginning of the lawsuit, okay? The next thing that happens, or shortly after, is called discovery, when each side asks the other for information. And it's just a huge dump of information all the time. And it's expensive to provide. The rules of civil discovery, which is what we're talking about in civil suits, say this. I know you don't care very much what the exact wording is, but here's the important part. It'll order you to produce the following, and there'll be a list, in the responding party's possession, custody, or control. Keep that in mind. Any electronically stored information, in any medium from which information can be obtained, hello forensics people, after translation by the responding party into a reasonably usable form. So this is what a subpoena looks like. If you haven't been lucky enough to see one, we'll just scroll up. This one in particular says, you are commanded to produce and permit inspection and copying of the following documents or objects at the place, date, and time specified below. All correspondence and or documents memorializing the communication between you and any officer, manager, partner, member, or employee of Sucker LLC regarding the idea we had and you stole. And then there'll be something attached to explain exactly what kind of documents that means. And here, the word documents means all those things. And you'll remember, in your possession, custody, control. This is all the things you can think of. Which means if you're a pen tester or an auditor, you may have to produce logs of your tests, test results, any data that you have in your possession, custody, or control still. That has two problems. One is it's really expensive. Another is you don't want to become the company that gives up all the data you got before, right, and didn't keep it safe. So you have the time and expense of interrupting your business. You have to pay lawyers to do this stuff because you can't find yourself. You have to worry about the reputational problems. Dealing with a lawyer is bad enough. But imagine you have all this data, and this guy shows up at your door and says, I'd like to see everything you have. You don't want to be woken up or have your business interrupted with a bunch of guys with FBI windbreakers. But if you have this data sitting around, that's a potential problem. So what can you do? Well, the first is when you do this sort of thing, you need to start with rules of engagement. This is going to be all 80s movies, I think. To start with, if this box is off limits, and that one you can hit, a detailed listing of what exactly you're going to touch, so that someone in charge has decided these are things that we're okay with, we're prepared if something bad happens. More than the sort of thing you usually do when you have, just because you have to do the work. You need to worry about the worst thing that can happen. And if a server falls over, you need to know who to call. And he needs to know who to call. need to decide between you, between the company you're working for and your company, how you're going to secure data. What's the level of security that they care about? Because it's a big pain for you, but it's important to both of you. And how you're going to dispose of the data when you're done, right? What kind of wipe does it have to be? Most important, once you figure out all those things, write them down. Both sides need to agree in writing, so no one can go back later and say, oh, that's not what I meant. Something like, do not fire unless fired upon. Some rules that will say, this is exactly, that's the movie reference, nobody? That will say exactly what you plan to do. Another thing you can try is indemnification. Now, does anybody have any idea what that means? You, what does it mean?
It means that you're responsible for it no matter what happens.
Who's responsible?
The investor.
I'm sorry?
The investor.
So say I ask him to indemnify me, what does that mean?
Protect you, hold you harmless.
I'm sorry?
Hold you harmless.
What does that mean? Hold you harmless.
I promise not to sue you if you move around too much so I can't get the camera on you. But you're doing just fine.
Okay. So all that is very close. Indemnification means that somebody agrees, the indemnifier agrees to pay in case you're sued for whatever your losses are, right? If you have damages. So if I'm a tester and I work for, say, Citibank, Citibank agrees to indemnify me, that is, to pay whatever I end up having to pay if I get sued. So if one of their cardholders sues me, or in this case, one of the other banks sues me, they will pay my expenses. So it won't be up to me to pay for all that. Now, there's a little bit of a problem there. Assume that this is true. I don't know that it was for sure. But you have card systems, right? Card systems is dealing with Merrick Bank, one of its member banks. That's the bank that's sued. And Merrick Bank has a contract with card systems. Also, Merrick Bank sues Savvis. Now, why? Because card systems is in bankruptcy. Now, Savvis might have had, we don't know, but might have had an indemnification agreement with card systems, where card systems agrees to pay. So that even though card systems wasn't sued, if Merrick Bank sues Savvis, then card systems will pay, because Savvis is indemnified. The problem is, card systems is in bankruptcy, and so that's just not going to work. There's nobody to collect from. That's bad. Another thing, good insurance. Not just the kind of insurance you have on your motorcycle, right? Because you can't really hurt that many other people with a motorcycle. Really good insurance, so that if you're sued, it doesn't put your company out of business. This is the kind of insurance you can get pretty easily, but a lot of people don't. I end up pushing clients to it all the time, and they wait. I had two clients wait long enough that something then happened and they couldn't get insurance. Set limits on liability. Now, this will not help if the other company goes out of business. But if they're still in business, you can set limits on how much they can sue you for. So you might limit it. One very common thing is to limit the value of the contract. Now, that is mostly arbitrary. But that's okay, because your contracts probably aren't as big as their damages could be. And so while that's painful, it's not the end. Of course, there are still problems. If the other company declares bankruptcy, that indemnification isn't really going to help. If the government investigates, there's not a lot you can do. You sort of have to cooperate as best you can. If there's a subpoena or a search warrant, one of the things you can do is, when you have time to respond to certain things, call the company up and say, look, we're not paying lawyers to defend this. It's your data. We're happy to have you defend it. Off you go. Here's the subpoena. And we're not paying. And you can do whatever you want. We'll cooperate. And that's very common. You need a plan in advance. When these things happen, you can't run around trying to figure out what's going to happen right away, because you're going to make bad decisions and you're going to forget things. So you need to think these things up ahead of time. You need a search warrant recovery plan. If the FBI shows up and takes everything, remember that line from Animal House, or even taking the stuff we didn't steal. If they come and take everything, you need to be able to recover your business. This does happen. I've had clients not get their computers back for months. Imagine not being able to get your data for months. Now, one thing you can do is you can use offsite storage. I make a big deal about this in a cloud talk I give about how dangerous it is. But offsite encrypted storage isn't a bad idea if it's just sitting there and you can get it when you need it. And you need a standard subpoena response. Your response may be, we call the client and tell them they can do whatever they want. But you need to be prepared to do that. You need to know what you have to send over. You can't just send a subpoena and say, oh, by the way, subpoena, right? You need to know what you have and have a log of all the data that you have that might be vulnerable, right? This is an attack. Talk to the lawyer. He can help you work through these things. Whatever lawyer you happen to use, you know, your brother-in-law, whoever it is, work through these problems so you can come up with a plan in advance. See how we're doing on time? Good, I'm not talking too fast. So, forensics and incident response. We're going to put these two together also. Imagine that there's a data breach at a hospital, right? That never happens, right? That's why electronic medical records are such a good idea, because hospitals never leak data. So there's a breach, and the hospital ships you all the data. Now you have all their data, right? Now you have to worry about keeping all their data safe, which is a big deal. And you can't say it's now your responsibility to keep this stuff safe. And you have some very similar problems. For instance, you may have a subpoena. There's a reason that thing is in big, heavy font. It's the heaviest font I could find. It made the file really big using that big font. Responding to a subpoena is a big deal. And if you have all this physical data and you're doing forensics on it, what are you just going to make copies of them and send them over? Right? You know what's on there. The whole point of this exercise was to figure out what was on there. In your possession, custody, or control, remember, it's anything you have control of or have possession of. So, what will you have to produce if that happens? If you get a subpoena, what kinds of information will you have to turn over? If there's a search warrant, what will you do? It will stop your business. Now you think, well, it's just a contract, and if I can't do the contract because there's a search warrant, what do I care? Well, there are two problems with that. The first is if you're not working, you're not getting paid, right? So if you plan to do this project, now you're not because the FBI came and borrowed the drives for a year and a half. That's how it is. The second problem is that you have to have some agreement with the company you're working for that says, if there's some horrible thing that happens, if there's a hurricane or a search warrant execution or some other act of God, it's okay that you stop working, you won't get sued for it. You might say, well, it's not my fault. Well, the risk has to be somebody's. And you really need to figure out whose risk it will be ahead of time. If they cart away all this stuff in boxes, what do you do next? You need a plan for these things. Offsite storage for this is not really an option, right? You can't use the transporter and send a copy of the evil twin over to the offsite storage place. So you need clear data security policies. You have to, it isn't that your security has to be perfect. I mean, it ought to be good, right? But it doesn't have to be perfect. But you need to agree ahead of time with the company that you're working for how secure it will be. The reason for this is if you agree how secure it will be, and then later something happens, they can't say, well, we didn't know that. You say, of course you did. We sent you pictures, right? We sent you models of locks. We sent you the safe we had. So you knew everything. And they're not just paper policies. You need to follow your policies. We wrote it on paper. We have a good policy. Now we can move on. 3 things you need to do. To the extent you can, for data that you create, you need to encrypt it. You also need to encrypt it. And third, you should encrypt it. And if you do all those 3 things, you'll probably be a lot better off. It's a little bit of a pain, but not that much of a pain anymore, right? Keep it on an encrypted drive someplace that you can still access. I encrypt all of my client files, and so I can take them around. and not feel nervous about what happens if I lose my keys, right, on my USB drive on. One way or another, you have to secure the data, and you have to be careful about it. You have to be non-negligent, for one thing. But more than that, you have to be more careful than you otherwise are forced to be. You need a safe. This seems obvious, but don't get a safe if you're just going to leave it sitting around for people to pick up and leave with, right? Bolt the thing to the floor, all right? Make it a little bit difficult. Come up with a plan for how to turn over data if you have to. Who you're going to contact either before or during, or if you have to after it happens, right? If the FBI shows up, your first call is probably to your lawyer. Your second call should be to the company who owns the data. Not going to be an easy call, but if they know that that's the kind of thing that can happen, they're at least prepared for it, and you know who to call. And when they come asking nicely, this will be a shock, but it won't seem like the end of the world. You need to know exactly who the person is who's responsible. And if that guy's on vacation or sick, who the next person is. A clear line of communication is very important because companies can deal with failures a lot of the time, but they can't deal with failures they don't know about. And again, set limits on liabilities. It's just like before. You need to come up with ways to limit your exposure if they decide to sue you for something you think wasn't your fault. Maybe they think it was your fault. Maybe they think you provided just regular dogs. Indemnification is just as much of a problem here. Fight for it. Don't succumb to these mutual indemnification things that really don't mean anything. You indemnify me and I indemnify you, and now none of us owes anybody. Right? That's not equal. That's just stupid. Right? There aren't two sides. You have to, the idea behind these agreements ahead of time is one, to make sure that people know what the deal is. What are we agreeing to ahead of time? What's going to happen so there aren't surprises? The other, though, is that you want to agree whose risk it is when these things happen. It's better to do it when you're looking at it in the objective, right? You're saying, oh, well, we don't know what kind of bad things would happen, whose fault it would be. Let's think about it ahead of time, without the pain of the FBI in the room, whose fault, whose risk, who should bear the risk? Because it's going to be somebody's, right? Somebody's going to have to pay for this sort of thing. Remember the indemnification problem, though. If the company goes out of business and a third party decides to sue you, that's bad. Now, this suit is still going on, and it's not clear exactly who's going to be responsible. There's a little bit of complicated law. It changes by state about when third parties when you have a duty to third parties that you know about. But you don't want to have to fight about it because a huge lawsuit like this may just be enough to put your company out of business. Good insurance. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but you need insurance and a plan. Both types. A search warrant recovery plan, what to do if this happens, and a standard subpoena response. All you have to do is decide what you're going to do so that you can execute it later. But you need to decide now. And finally, talk to your lawyer. Doesn't have to be a long conversation. You just have to figure out what the risks are. There are a few more risks than I've discussed up here, but you want to know them ahead of time. Yes, he's a sleazy lawyer, but he's my sleazy lawyer. You'll feel that way one day. And finally, if you like lawyer jokes, next time you're in jam, call it a meeting. So, questions?
Quick question.
Yep.
About insurance. Does the use of like errors and omissions liability insurance cover that, or is there like a specific type of insurance you want to pursue for like end up error insurance fund?
Well, you're going to want to find companies that do tech, that handle tech, so they'll know what the heck you're talking about. You can't really send them a DVD of sneakers, right? You want somebody ahead of time who's going to know what these things are. And there'll be errors and it's similar to errors and omissions. Errors and omissions is just a kind of liability insurance. But you need to actually read the thing or have somebody who knows what they're talking about, read the thing to see what's included, and whether it includes the kinds of things that you're working on. Companies will differ for no apparent reason on what they cover. Anybody else? Know Stump the Lawyer? Have you ever heard the case where? Okay, if you had a question that you didn't want to, for some reason, yell out to the lawyer in a room full of your friends, that's fine, just come talk to me later. Otherwise, thank you for listening.